Titans of the touchpads and duchesses and dukes of the drum sounds, it's Prof. G, and in this lesson we're going to show a solution to the drum machine challenge from the prior lesson. We'll demonstrate a solution using lists and loops that radically cut down the code that we need to write, and even more fun, we're going to hook up our touchpads to a gyro and some fruit to get funky, food group style. Let's learn big. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the original Funkmeisters of the Fruit Drums on the Adafruit website. Be sure to consult the firm's Learn Guides for all sorts of learning and inspiration. So if you need a refresher from the challenge at the end of the last lesson, here it is. But in this solution, I've also added a little bit more code. I'm going to turn on all of the NeoPixels in a different color, depending on what touchpad is touched. And now to begin, plug in that Circuit Playground board, Blue Fruit or Express. Start up PyCharm. If you're new here, welcome. You may want to check out the prior lessons in the playlist to see how we got to this point. Now remember, since this is a challenge solution, we've discussed all of the code techniques in the solution in depth in other lessons. So we won't go into depth here, but if you need more info, please see those earlier lessons. And now I've got the code up from our last lesson, capacitive touch debound CircuitPython. I'm going to change the comment up top to read drum-machine, and let's get rid of some of the code that we don't need. These touchpads aren't going to be debounced, so I'm going to get rid of this from Adafruit debouncer line. Oh, and down here when we set up our NeoPixels, why don't we create a list to hold our colors? So we'll say colors equals, and in between square brackets, I'm going to head up here to where we read in or import those colors. I'll highlight the first 7, actually I think I've got 8 here, but that's okay, and copy those colors, then paste them in between the square brackets of this colors list so that each color is an element of the colors list. And yeah, I only have 7 pads, so I'm only going to use 7 colors in here so I can get rid of purple at the end. Now I'm going to set my touchpads up an entirely different way, so I'm going to delete the code for setting up touchpads here, and my while true is going to be different, so I'll delete that code as well. And before we set up the touchpads, why don't we read in the drum samples? So the challenge said that you should create a list named drum samples, so we'll set that equal to square brackets. And so I don't have to type in all the names. I'm actually going to head over in the Finder and go in my CircuitPy volume into the drum sounds folder, and I'm going to highlight and copy all of the sounds that we have here. And on the Mac, what this does is it will copy all of the strings that we have listed here. I'll paste those into PyCharm, and to turn these into strings, I'll put a double quote before each of these names. Then I'll end them in double quote comma, copy that and paste that behind all 7, although the last one shouldn't end in a comma. I'll end this in a closed square bracket and make sure I've got the open square bracket starting this list. And then I'll just put them all on the same line, but I'll use the backslash character so that I can see these on 2 lines. Remember that backslash character is the line extension character. Cool. If, by the way, you run code and you get a message like no such file/directory, you either spelled the file name wrong, you don't have it in the list, or you don't have it in the folder on your CircuitPy volume. Now let's set up these touchpads. And you might have used a different technique to set up touchpads, but I'm going to show you that we can use a list for this. Let me first show you what I'm going to do and describe how this differs from the earlier approach we used. So previously we created a different variable for each touchpad. In the prior lesson we had just 3 touchpads, but you could create 7 variables like this, giving each one a separate name. And remember how we create a touchpad, we call the touch.io library's touch.in class and pass in the location of the pad, so that's board.a1, board.a2, all the way up to board.tx. Now we could have repeated this same setup essentially 7 times with just a little bit of change in here. We changed the variable name and the touchpad location, but instead we're going to do this. We're going to create a single list named pads, and inside this list will be 7 elements, 1 for each location of the touchpad, board.a1, board.a2, all the way up to board.tx. Now you see how we passed the location into touchio.touchin to create a touchpad? Well, instead of creating separate variables with a separate name for each touchpad, we're instead going to create a single list called touchpads, and we'll loop through all of the locations in the pads list, and we'll use each location to create a new touch-in object. Once we've created that, we're going to append it to the touchpads list. Remember, append adds an element to the end of the list. So if we start out with an empty list, but we go through it 7 times, we're adding 1 element, 2 element, 3 element, until by the end, we've got 7 elements added to that list. So by the time we've looped through all 7 pad locations, we've got 7 touch-in objects. There'll be 1 in each element of the touchpads list. Now, the reason why this is ultra cool is because we can then check each pad, not by using separate if statements like we did in the previous lesson, but instead by looping through all of the touch pads and using just one if statement with an index to test each pad's value. See how efficient this is? Lists are a fantastic way to create nearly identical items, and since you can loop through them, you can minimize the code that you write to perform the same action with each list element. So hopefully that was clear. Let's code things up using the technique I just showed. First, I'm going to put all of the touchpad locations in a list called pads. So I'm going to say pads equals, and in between square brackets, board.a1, comma board.a2, comma board.a3, comma board.a4, comma board.a5, comma board.a6, comma board. And remember that last one is called TX, not board A7. Now these are locations of the touchpads, but they're not set up as touch IO objects. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a list called touchpads with those touch IO objects. Now in order to do that, I'm going to start out with an empty list. So touchpads equals, open and close brackets, there's nothing in touchpads, but then I'm going to loop through all of the elements of that pads list that I created up top. Those are all of the individual locations of the touchpads, and I'll use those one by one to create a touch IO object. Remember, that acts just like a button, and I'll append that to the touchpad list. So we'll create the loop with for pad in pads, colon, press return, and I'm going to add or append a new element to the touchpads list for pad I as I go through these. And actually, I'm not using the index value I, I'm iterating through pads, same result. So watch what happens in this line here. I'm going to say touchpads.append. What am I going to append? Well, in between parentheses, I'm going to create that individual touchpad. So I'm going to say touchio dot touch in, capital T, capital I, and pass in pad. So as earlier we used a single variable for each touchpad, now we have a list to hold all of those touchpads. And this will allow us to write really compact and efficient code in our while true loop. You'll see in just a bit. And just so you have some notes in here in the comments, I'm going to write now you can test each touchpad's .value property like this, touchpad in brackets I.value. So now let's try our while true loop, while true colon, and then inside of this we're going to loop through every touchpad in the list and see if it's been touched. So we'll say for I in range in parentheses, len in parentheses, touchpads, colon at the end. Length of touchpads is 7, so range 7 goes through values from 0 to 6. By the way, you can't enumerate in here. For some reason you can't say for I, comma, touchpad in here and enumerate on the touchpads. That won't work. So inside to check on the individual touchpads, we'll say if touchpads in between brackets I dot value colon. This is checking to see if the touchpad was touched. And if it was touched, we're first going to fill in all of our pixels with the color at that index value. So we'll say pixels dot fill, and between parentheses, we'll pass in colors bracket I. So you get how this works. If you touch the touchpad that's at index 3, for example, you're going to show the color that's at index 3. Cool. And under this, we're going to do something very similar. We're going to say play underscore sound, and we want to pass in a string of a file name to play. And we're just going to pass in drum samples bracket I bracket. What that's going to do is it's going to go up here for the index value and find the element of the drum samples list that's at that index value and play that sound. So that'll give us the color and the sound that correspond to the trackpad number that was pressed. Then when we're done playing, we're going to turn the pixels off by saying pixels.fill and in parentheses, all caps black. Now let's try this out. Open up the terminal, get into TO, save your work. And you can see here that I have an external speaker hooked up just so that the sounds come through a little louder. I showed you how to hook this up in an earlier lesson. You can use the 2 clip end alligator clips. Any ground goes to the base of the jack sleeve, while the audio pad goes to the tip of the jack. Now, one thing worth mentioning, the sensitivity of each touch is calculated at runtime. So if you start your code while you touch a pad or something connected to a pad, you might find that it goes off continually. But if you just restart your code, you can just press the reset button, make sure you're not touching any of the pads, then you should find that the sensitivity is properly set. And if that doesn't work, you can read up on setting the threshold in the touchio library. But now let's try things out. So as I touch each pad, the color and sound at the same index of the pad are used. All the touchpads seem to work. And if you hold down your finger on a pad, since the pads aren't to bounce, the sounds will restart playing as long as the finger is on a pad. And now to get funky with one of the food groups, organic matter like fruit are good conductors so they can carry a change in capacitance, so they act like extensions of the pads themselves. What I've done here is I've taken 7 wires with alligator clips on one end, pins on another, except for this one that I've clipped to the euro. I wanted to rock some genuine euro beats here, so I've got a euro for that. Then I've got a Granny Smith apple, a grapefruit, a banana, a lemon, a lime, and a tangerine. So let's play that funky fruit, Pythonista. Oh, that sound is mellifluous. Call the Grammys. I think we have a winner. Now be sure to save your code to your CircuitPython school folder as drummachine.py. Close this outer tab, and in this lesson we went a bit beyond the original challenge. We added some lights to the mix, but more importantly, we learned how we can use lists to create multiple elements of related objects and use loops to quickly examine their status and act on the results. I hope you feel good about the skills you are acquiring, Pythonista. If so, be sure to tell friends, educators, and drop some kindness with a like and a comment. There's more goodness to come. Continue to hack.